In the middle of a slow, gray river that flowed through a small medieval town stood a bridge that was older than most of its citizens. It was not a grand bridge. No marble arches, no statues, no triumphal gates. It was built of rough-hewn stone, its surface uneven from centuries of footsteps. Carts rattled, boots echoed, and horses clopped across its span from dawn until dusk. At its midpoint sat a small wooden hut, little more than a box with a window, and inside that hut lived a man, whose job it was to watch. His name, according to the old parish records, was Thomas of Wickham, though few ever used it. Most simply called him the bridge keeper. Every morning, Thomas would wake before the first trader arrived. He lived in a small cottage on the riverbank, just beyond the willow trees. His life was quiet, repetitive, and as steady as the water that moved beneath the stones. His duty was simple: to keep count of who crossed, to collect the small tolls, and to ensure that no one damaged the bridge. It sounds mundane, and it was. But it was a kind of mundanity that defined his entire world. In the year 1382, a toll bridge was not merely a means of crossing water. It was an economic artery, a place where trade and travel could be measured coin by coin. The bridge keeper was not a man of influence, but his presence was essential. Without him, goods moved freely without record, and the lord who owned the land on either side would lose his due. So Thomas sat, day after day, counting. He kept a leather-bound ledger, worn soft at the corners. Each page bore neat columns: the date, the type of traveler, the payment. A card of wool, 1 penny. A shepherd with 6 sheep, a halfpenny. A pilgrim, nothing. By the bishop's order, Thomas rarely spoke, but he observed everything. He saw which merchants prospered, who grew thin after a hard winter, and when new faces arrived from distant towns. Sometimes he counted not only coins but steps. He claimed that walking from one end of the bridge to the other took 71 paces, though in truth it was closer to 68. He would measure the difference again every few weeks, muttering quietly as he walked, perhaps out of boredom, or perhaps out of ritual. In a way, it was his own form of prayer, a meditation in motion. Those who crossed often thought of him as part of the bridge itself. They greeted him briefly, sometimes with a nod, rarely with a smile. Children whispered that if you crossed without paying, he would rise in the night and fetch you back. It wasn't true, of course. Thomas never left his post during daylight hours, and at night he slept deeply, lulled by the steady rhythm of the river. But his life was not without its subtleties. He took note of how the bridge changed, how the stones shifted slightly in spring thaw, how moss crept up the lower parapets, how the mortar between the cobbles crumbled a little more each year. He knew which sections were slick after rain and which echoed hollowly underfoot. There was comfort in knowing something so completely. The bridge had been built, according to local tales, by a group of monks centuries earlier. The abbey had long since fallen into disrepair, but the bridge endured, its maintenance funded by tolls and local taxes. It was said that beneath the bridge, deep in the mud, lay the bones of a donkey that had carried stones during its construction, only to fall in and be buried by time. Thomas liked that story. It reminded him that everything, even a donkey, had its part to play in keeping the world connected. One autumn morning, the mist lay thick across the river. The water was invisible, the far bank shrouded entirely. Thomas lit a small candle in his hut, the flame trembling with every draft. He waited for the sound of hoofs, the creak of carts, but nothing came. The whole town seemed to sleep. He leaned out the window and listened. Only the faint sound of water against stone. He wondered how many times he had heard that sound. Tens of thousands, perhaps. The same notes played endlessly day after day. Yet he never tired of it. In the stillness, he reflected on the lives that crossed before him. The miller's daughter who once brought him bread in gratitude for finding her lost coin. The traveling friar who stayed to talk about the nature of patience. The soldier who crossed once and never returned. Each person, in their own way, had used the bridge to move forward. Thomas, meanwhile, remained fixed, a human fixture on a structure built for motion. He sometimes wondered what lay beyond the far bank, not in the literal sense, for he'd crossed it countless times, but in the larger sense. What happened to the people after they left his sight? What stories continued after the bridge faded behind them? In many ways, his post was like a mirror of life itself. Moments passing, footsteps fading, and yet the bridge remained. The toll chest beside him was half full by noon. He jotted each entry with precise strokes. Even the smallest discrepancy in his accounts could invite suspicion. Years of quiet diligence had earned him trust, but not attention. He existed in that middle space between essential and invisible, a state he had come to prefer. Sometimes, during long afternoons, he would walk the length of the bridge and pause midway, leaning on the parapet to watch the current below. Leaves floated past like fragments of forgotten letters, carried downstream toward places he'd never see. He would think of time then, not in the grand historical sense, but as a steady flow. Like the river, it moved whether one cared to watch or not. To some, such thoughts might seem melancholy, but to Thomas, they were simply ordinary. At sunset, when the last cart crossed and the toll gate was closed, he would walk home along the embankment, his boots brushing through reeds. He never hurried. The bridge faded into silhouette behind him, its outlines softened by twilight. He would cook a simple meal, bread, cheese, a little ale, and sit by the small window of his cottage. From there, he could still see the bridge faintly through the mist, the way one might see an old memory that refuses to fade. And each night, as he drifted toward sleep, Thomas imagined the sound of footsteps continuing long after he was gone. Travelers crossing, merchants counting, lives intersecting briefly upon those stones. Perhaps that was the essence of his existence, to keep watch over a place where everyone moved forward except him. But then again, he thought, maybe staying still was its own kind of journey. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint rush of the river, and wondered, not for the first time, whether the bridge would remember him as he remembered it. By the turn of the century, the bridge had already outlived 3 kings to floods and countless repairs. Thomas of Wickham, still its keeper, had outlived nearly as many toll ledgers. The ink on the first had long since faded into pale brown, the parchment stiff with age. Yet each entry, written in his careful, almost delicate script, told a quiet history of its own. The rhythm of his life was measured not by the passing of years, but by the changing of the stones beneath his boots. Each time the town's masons came to patch a crack or replace a broken slab, Thomas marked it down in the back of his book, not out of duty, but as though he were recording the growth of something living. He often thought of the bridge as a creature, a patient, unmoving beast that bore the weight of generations. Its breath was the wind that passed through its arches. Its bones were the stones. Its heartbeat, the sound of steps echoing upon its back. In winter, the stones froze. The air turned brittle and the river below grew sluggish, heavy with ice. Thomas would wrap his hands in wool and light a small brazier in his hut to keep warm. From time to time, he'd chip away frost that gathered along the wooden shutters, watching the faint glimmer of his breath rise like smoke. Few travelers crossed in those months. The merchants stayed close to hearths, the fishermen avoided the frozen banks, and only the desperate or the devout attempted the journey. It was in those silent weeks that Thomas's thoughts deepened, turning inward like the river itself. He began keeping a second ledger, not one of tolls, but of thoughts. Short lines, half sentences, the kind one writes when speaking only to oneself. The bridge holds the cold longer than the earth. I counted 70 steps today, but it felt like 80. The water below moves as if reluctant to be seen. It was not poetry, not really, but it was something that kept him company. Sometimes the townsfolk came to the hut to talk. The baker, whose ovens faced the river, would bring him crust of bread still warm from the morning's fire. The blacksmith's apprentice once lingered to complain about the cost of crossing with heavy tools. And every few weeks, the steward of the lord's estate came to collect the toll chest, weighing the coins, nodding briefly, saying little. Thomas never sought friendship, but neither did he avoid it. He belonged to that peculiar class of people who are known by everyone and remembered by few. In the year of the Great Thaw, when the ice finally broke, the river swelled higher than anyone could recall. It began with a rumble in the distance, the sound of water straining against itself. By dusk, the current roared beneath the arches, tearing branches and debris along in its wake. Thomas stood on the midpoint of the bridge, his cloak whipping in the wind. He watched as the lowest stones vanished beneath brown foam. It was said that every few decades, the river tried to reclaim what man had built. This year, it seemed determined. By midnight, the water had reached the lower walkway, and Thomas knew that if it rose much higher, the whole structure might give way. But he stayed, lantern in hand, watching. He told himself he stayed to guard it, to be present if the worst came. But in truth, he simply could not look away. The bridge had become, over the years, more than his duty. It was his anchor in a world that changed often and to fast. By dawn, the water had begun to fall again. The bridge held. When the masons arrived 2 days later to inspect the damage, they found Thomas asleep in his hut, soaked but smiling faintly, as though he had endured a battle. And the following spring brought travelers once again, merchants, peasants, pilgrims. The rhythm of crossings resumed, each footstep echoing the ones that came before. But Thomas noticed something new. The middle stones, the ones directly beneath his hut, had shifted, only slightly, perhaps half an inch, but enough that one could feel the uneven dip when walking over them. He mentioned it to the mason, who shrugged and said, "Bridges bend before they break. This one has plenty of life left." Still, Thomas kept watch. He began counting steps again. 71 one day, 70 the next. He grew convinced that the shift in the stones altered the measure. That time itself had stretched or contracted along with the bridge dot at night. When the town's lanterns flickered out, he would walk its length alone, listening to the hollow resonance beneath his boots. He began to think that the bridge spoke, in its own way, not in words, but in murmurs of creaking wood and settling stone. And perhaps, he thought, all things that endure for long enough develop a kind of memory. He wondered whether the bridge remembered its builders, the monks who once sang over the mortar as they worked. He wondered whether it remembered each flood, each frost, each footstep. Maybe it remembered him too. One evening, a traveler stopped midway and asked Thomas, "How many people do you think have crossed this bridge since it was built?" Thomas paused. It was not the kind of question he could answer with numbers alone. "Enough," he said finally, "that the stones have forgotten where one life ends and the next begins." The traveler laughed softly, thinking it a jest, and continued on. But Thomas did not laugh. He wrote the words down later that night in his second ledger, unsure why they felt important. Years passed in this quiet fashion. The world around him shifted. New laws, new rulers, new goods from lands he'd never see. But on the bridge, everything seemed the same. Until, one morning, a crack appeared. It ran like a thin dark vein along the southern parapet, harmless at first glance. But to Thomas's eye, it was a wound. He traced it with his fingers, feeling the roughness of age. The masons were called once again. They patched it with lime and stone, reassuring him that the structure was sound. But Thomas no longer trusted their certainty. He began to sense that the bridge was weary, not broken, not yet, but tired in a way only he could perceive. Perhaps, he thought, the bridge and he were not so different. Both had borne weight for too long. Both had watched countless lives pass without moving themselves. Both had held steady through storms, floods, and time. Sometimes, when the sun set and the water glimmered like metal beneath him, he imagined letting go of the post, the tolls, the endless counting. He pictured himself walking to the far bank and not stopping. But each morning, habit reclaimed him. He returned to his hut, opened his ledger, and waited for the first echo of footsteps. For that was his life, to witness motion without joining it. And in that strange stillness, perhaps there was peace still. On certain nights, when the wind shifted just right, he swore he could hear the bridge whisper beneath him, not with words, but with the deep, low groan of stone remembering its purpose. What was it saying? He couldn't tell. Perhaps it was simply reminding him that everything, no matter how silent, carries its own kind of voice. And one day, someone would have to listen. Someone would have to listen. Years slipped by as quietly as water sliding beneath the arches. The town grew busier, the tolls heavier. Children Thomas had once watched toddle across the bridge, now crossed it with their own children in tow. The stones grew smoother, the moss thicker, and the faint crack along the southern wall had widened just enough for rain to collect inside. Thomas himself had grown old, though no one could say exactly how old. His beard, once the color of river sand, was now the color of frost. His hands, gnarled and thin, still moved carefully across the pages of his ledger. His eyesight had faded somewhat, but his hearing remained sharp, attuned to every creak and echo that passed through the bridge. He lived as he always had, by the rhythm of crossings and the quiet patience of waiting. And though the seasons changed, the bridge remained the same, or at least it seemed to. Then, one afternoon in early spring, something unusual happened. A small crowd had gathered on the western bank, just before the toll gate. A merchant's wagon had overturned, spilling crates of grain into the mud. People shouted, horses whinnied, and Thomas watched from his hut as chaos unfolded. He was too old to rush forward, but his presence alone brought calm. He stepped out slowly, his cane tapping the stones. "One at a time," he said, his voice thin but firm. "The bridge will wait, but the water won't." They listened, perhaps out of habit more than respect. Within the hour, the wagon was righted, and the grain salvaged. The crowd dispersed, leaving Thomas to return to his place. When he reached the midpoint, however, he stopped. There, near the edge of the parapet, another crack had formed, longer this time, running almost the full length of one stone. He touched it gently. It was shallow still, but the pattern of the fracture was clear. The bridge was changing. That night, he couldn't sleep. The wind rose, rattling the shutters of his cottage. He lay awake listening to the familiar creak of timbers, the distant rush of the river. In his half-dreaming state, he imagined the bridge speaking to him, not in words, but in sensations, a deep groaning, a shuddering breath. He rose before dawn, walked to the river bank, and watched as the first light touched the stones. Mist clung to the arches like a veil. For a moment, the whole world seemed suspended. The bridge, the water, even the air. Then faintly, he heard it, a crack, followed by a low, grinding sigh. He crossed quickly, 70 steps, not counting. Halfway across, he saw it. A section of mortar had fallen away entirely, leaving a small gap between stones. The bridge trembled faintly underfoot, just enough to feel like a heartbeat skipping once. He stood there for a long time, his cane resting against the parapet, eyes fixed on the current below. Later that morning, he went to the town council to report it. The steward, a younger man now, one who had replaced the old lord's servant years before, nodded distractedly. As Thomas spoke, "The bridge still stands, does it not?" The steward said, "We'll send masons in the summer. There are more pressing matters now. The grain stores, the new road to the north." Thomas nodded. He had heard such words before, yet something within him tightened, a quiet certainty that time was running out. For both himself and the bridge, he returned to his hut and opened his second ledger, the one not meant for anyone else's eyes. His handwriting trembled as he wrote, "If the bridge is to fall, it will fall quietly, as all faithful things do." The following weeks passed in uneasy calm. The weather warmed. Travelers came and went. The bridge held. Then, one evening in early May, the rain came, not in drops, but in sheets. It fell without pause, turning the cobble slick, the air heavy. By midnight, the river had risen higher than Thomas had ever seen. The current clawed at the arches, swirling with debris and foam. He lit his lantern and stepped outside. His cloak clung to him like a second skin, the wind biting through the fabric. The sound of water was deafening. He reached the midpoint, where the bridge had always felt most alive, and peered down. The river was no longer a gentle presence, it was a living, thrashing force, striking the stone with the strength of ages. Thomas could see cracks widening before his eyes, small fragments of mortar crumbling into the current. Yet still he stood, gripping the parapet. He whispered softly, as if speaking to a companion, "You've held us all this time. Don't stop now." The bridge shuddered. One of the smaller arches gave a low, deep groan, not of pain, but of release. At that moment, a great roar came from beneath, and part of the southern wall collapsed into the torrent below. Water sprayed up, soaking him completely. Thomas stumbled backward, coughing, the lantern slipping from his grasp and rolling across the stones. Its light flickered wildly, casting trembling shadows on the cracked parapet. He looked toward the far bank, the eastern shore, barely visible through rain, and thought of all the travelers who had crossed under his watch. The merchants, the children, the monks, the soldiers. 1,000 lives moving forward while he stayed behind. And for the first time, he felt the bridge not as a place, but as a memory, one that existed because he had remembered it. He turned, limped toward the hut, and took shelter as thunder rolled across the valley. He sat there through the night, trembling with the storm, listening to the bridge groan and sigh beneath the weight of water. In time. By dawn, the rain had ceased. The river was swollen, brown and thick, but the bridge still stood, one arch missing, but standing nonetheless. The townsfolk came running, gasping at the damage, shouting orders for repairs. Thomas said nothing. He only smiled faintly, his eyes fixed on the remaining arches. It remembered, he murmured. It held. In the days that followed, workers patched the breach with timber scaffolds and new stone. The council thanked him for his vigilance, though few truly understood the depth of his watch. A month later, when the new section was complete, Thomas recorded one last note in his ledger. The handwriting was faint, wavering. 71 steps again. The bridge lives. He passed away that summer, in his sleep, by the sound of the river. They buried him near the willow trees on the western bank, where the water ran slow and clear. For a time, his hut remained empty, the door creaking gently in the wind. Travelers still crossed. The toll was still collected. Life went on. But those who walked across the bridge in the early dawn sometimes claimed they heard an odd sound, a soft tapping, like a cane against stone, keeping count of invisible steps. And when the river ran high, and the mist hung low across the arches, some said the bridge itself seemed to hum, a low, rhythmic murmur, like breath moving through old stone. They said it was the bridge remembering, and perhaps it was. After all, every bridge is more than a crossing. It is a memory made solid, connecting what was to what will be. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of the one who counted every step between. The one who counted every step between.